Three great discoveries were made and tragically lost during the 20th century. The first of these was the secret of invisibility. The secret of invisibility was discovered in 1909 by Archibald Prater, emissary from the court of Edward VII to the court of Sultan Abd el-Krim, ruler of a small state loosely allied to the Ottoman Empire. Prater, an amateur but enthusiastic biologist, was injecting mice with various serums for the purpose of finding an injection which would cause mutations. When he injected his 3019th mouse, the mouse disappeared. It was still there, he could feel it in his hand, but he could not see a hair or claw of it. He put it carefully in a cage and 2 hours later it appeared again, unharmed. He experimented with increasing dosages and found that he could make a mouse invisible for up to 24 hours. Larger doses made it ill or torpid. He also learned that a mouse killed while invisible reappeared instantly at the moment of death. Realizing the importance of his discovery, he wired his resignation to England, dismissed his servants, and locked himself in his quarters, and began to experiment with himself. Starting with a small injection that made him invisible for only a few minutes, he worked up until he found his tolerance was equal to that of mice. An injection that made him invisible for more than 24 hours also made him ill. He also found that although nothing of his body was visible, not even his dentures if he kept his lips closed, nudity was essential. Clothing did not become invisible with him. Prater was an honest and fairly well-to-do man, so he did not think of crime. He decided to return to England and offer his discovery to His Majesty's government for use in espionage or war. But first, he decided to allow himself one indulgence. He'd always been curious about the closely guarded harem of the Sultan to whose court he had been attached. Why not have a close look at it from the inside? Besides, some nagging thought that he couldn't quite isolate bothered him about his discovery. There was some circumstance under which he couldn't get beyond that point in his mind. An experiment was definitely in order. He stripped and made himself invisible for the maximum period. It proved simple to walk past the armed eunuchs and enter the harem. He spent an interesting afternoon watching the 50-odd beauties at their daytime occupation of keeping themselves beautiful, bathing and anointing their bodies with scented oils and perfumes. One, a Circassian, especially attracted him. It occurred to him, just as it would have occurred to any man, that if he stayed the night, perfectly safe since he would be invisible until the following noon, he could keep her in sight to learn which room she slept in and, after the lights were out, join her. She would think the Sultan was favouring her with a visit. He kept her in sight and noticed the room she entered. An armed eunuch took his post at the curtained doorway, others at each of the other doorways to the sleeping rooms. He waited until he was sure she'd be asleep, and then, at a moment when the eunuch was looking down the hall and would not see the movement of the curtain, he slipped through it. The light had been dim in the hallway. Here the darkness was utter. But he groped carefully and managed to find the sleeping couch. Carefully he put out a hand and touched the sleeping woman. She screamed. What he'd not known was that the Sultan never visited the harem by night, but sent for one, or sometimes several, of his wives to visit his own quarters. And suddenly the eunuch who'd been outside was inside and had hold of him by the arm. The last thing he thought was that he now knew the one worrisome circumstance of invisibility. It was completely useless in pitch darkness. And the last thing he heard was the swish of the scimitar. The second great lost discovery was the secret of invulnerability. It was discovered in 1952 by a United States Navy radar officer, Lieutenant Paul Hickendorf. The device was electronic and consisted of a small box that could be carried handily in a pocket. When a switch on the box was turned on, the person carrying the device was surrounded by a force field whose strength, as far as it could be measured by Hickendorf's excellent mathematics, was as near as matters to infinite. The field was also completely impervious to any degree of heat and any quantity of radiation. Lieutenant Hickendorf decided that a man, or a woman or a child or a dog enclosed in the force field could withstand the explosion of a hydrogen bomb at close range and not be injured in the slightest degree. No hydrogen bomb had been exploded at that time, but at the moment he completed his device, the lieutenant happened to be on a ship, cruiser class, that was steaming across the Pacific en route to an atoll called Eniwetok, and the fact leaked out that they were there to assist in the first explosion of a hydrogen bomb. Lieutenant Hickendorf decided to get lost, to hide out on the target island and be there when the bomb went off, and also to be there unharmed after it went off, thereby demonstrating beyond all doubt that his discovery was workable, a defense against the most powerful weapon of all time. It proved difficult, but he hid out successfully and was there, only yards away from the H-bomb, having crept closer and closer during the countdown, when it exploded. His calculations had been completely correct, and he was not injured in the slightest, not scratched, not bruised, not burned. But Lieutenant Hickendorf had overlooked the possibility of one thing happening, and that one thing happened. He was blown off the surface of the Earth with much more than escape velocity, straight out, not even into orbit. 49 days later he fell into the sun, still completely uninjured, but unfortunately long since dead, since the force field carried with it enough air to last him only a few hours, and so his discovery was lost to mankind, at least for the duration of the 20th century. The third great discovery made and lost in the 20th century was the secret of immortality. It was the discovery of an obscure Moscow chemist named Ivan Ivanovich Smetakovsky in 1978. Smetakovsky left no record of how he made his discovery, or of how he knew before trying it that it would work, for the simple reason that it scared him stiff. For two reasons. He was afraid to give it to the world, and he knew that once he had given it, even to his own government, the secret would eventually leak through the curtain and cause chaos. The USSR could handle anything, but in the more barbaric and less disciplined countries, the inevitable result of an immortality drug would be a population explosion that would most assuredly lead to an attack on the enlightened communist countries. And he was afraid to take it himself because he wasn't sure he wanted to become immortal. With things as they were, even in the USSR, not to consider what they must be outside it, was it really worthwhile to live forever, or even indefinitely? He compromised by neither giving it to anyone else nor taking it himself for the time being, until he could make up his mind. Meanwhile, he carried with him the only dose of the drug he'd made up. It was only a minute quantity that fitted into a tiny capsule that was insoluble and could be carried in his mouth. He attached it to the side of one of his dentures so that it rested safely between denture and cheek, and he'd be in no danger of swallowing it inadvertently. But if he should so decide, at any time he could reach into his mouth, crush the capsule with a thumbnail, and become immortal. He decided so one day when, after coming down with a lobar pneumonia and being taken to a Moscow hospital, he learned, from overhearing a conversation between a doctor and nurse who wrongly thought he was asleep, that he was expected to die within a few hours. Fear of death proved greater than fear of immortality, whatever immortality might bring, so as soon as the doctor and nurse had left the room, he crushed the capsule and swallowed its contents. He hoped that, since death might be so imminent, the drug would work in time to save his life. It did work in time, although by the time it had taken effect, he'd slipped into semi-coma and delirium. 3 years later, he was still in semi-coma and delirium, and the Russian doctors had finally diagnosed his case and ceased to be puzzled by it. Obviously, Smetakovsky had taken some kind of immortality drug, one which they found impossible to isolate or analyze, and it was keeping him from dying and would no doubt do so indefinitely, if not forever. But unfortunately, it had also made immortal the bacteria that had caused his pneumonia in the first place and would now continue to maintain it forever. So the doctors, being realists and seeing no reason to burden themselves by giving him custodial care in perpetuity, simply buried him.